Well, aloha everyone, and welcome back to Biology 110, or People in Nature, here at Chaminade University. Today we're going to delve into Unit 10, which is going to talk about ecotourism. We'll talk about the definition of ecotourism, and then how ecotourism is able to benefit the future generations in comparison to, say, mass tourism, which is what we generally assume when we think of something like tourism. So let's talk about ecotourism, and I thought I'd start off with a quote from a man named Honey in 1995. So ecotourism is travel to fragile, pristine, and usually protected areas that strives to be low impact and usually small in scale. It helps educate the traveler, provides funds for conservation, directly benefits the economic development and political empowerment of local communities, and fosters respect for different cultures and for human rights. So, the idea is that going a little bit beyond regular nature tourism, you are actually going to a protected area and you are benefiting the protected area by being there. So you're not only are you not hurting the area and having low impact, you're actually benefiting the people and the area itself. And so the definition has to do with the benefits to conservation and people in the host country, and not just monetary benefits, right? Conservational benefits as well as the enjoyment, obviously, of the tourist, right? Recreational activities of the tourist. So usually there's some sort of recreational draw in areas like this. And it's a little bit more than traveling simply for the appreciation of nature. This is more for the quest of getting to a foreign land and imbibing that foreign land with first world funding, right, from your tourist dollars, to be able to conserve and enhance the arts and culture of that area, of those people. So it's a purposeful travel to natural areas in order to understand the culture and natural history of the environment, taking care not to alter the integrity of the ecosystem while producing economic opportunities that make the conservation of natural resources beneficial to local people. So let me unpack this. There's a lot of things in here. You see purposeful travel, and you see education, right, to understand the culture. So education is something that's going to come up multiple times throughout this talk. You're actually not only going to be learning about an area which you intentionally travel to in order to enjoy this culture, but you're also going to be taking that education back to your community, and whatever the third world culture, etc., that you're bringing back can be expanded to the first world community, so that the education is not just to the individual that travels, but to all of their friends and family, etc. You're also seeing economic opportunity. And that's really important. You have to remember that your first world tourist dollar goes a very far way in third world economies. And so presenting economic opportunities that allow the people to maintain conservation of the natural resources. And oftentimes, people in third world countries end up in situations where in order to feed their families, they have to decimate their local ecosystem, right? Mining or logging or foresting, etc. And so if we're able to figure out a way that they can end up with economic opportunities that avoid that, then we can preserve these lands. So it's a responsible way of traveling to a natural area that focuses on education, conservation of the environment, and improving the well-being of the local people. Oftentimes this means that you are going to be purchasing something that's a art, or going to see some sort of show that is going to be allowing the arts and language and culture of these local economies, or local people, to be part of their local economies. All right, so this was just a brainstormer, so if you were in class, I'd have you jot down a little note thinking about a recent holiday or vacation you've been on. I know this semester and last as well, because most of us have been on major quarantine restrictions. Most of us haven't been traveling, but if you can think of a major holiday that you've been on, and then consider the impact that your holiday had on the environment. If you were staying in a hotel, did you wash your sheets quite often? Were you kind of lax about turning off the lights, etc.? And then kind of consider some of the areas that you could seek to improve if you were to travel in the future, right? Consider how it could be a little bit more friendly to that ecosystem or environment. And just to kind of give you a scope of how important this is, tourism is one of the largest legitimate businesses in the world. It's up there with big oil. It generates approximately $3 trillion annually and is approximately 11% of the global gross national product. It's the largest industry in the world, essentially. It's the world's #1 employer, and it accounts for 10% of jobs globally. Of course, these are all pre-COVID numbers. I'm sure that it's taken quite a hit in recent eras. However, my point is that it became a huge market without any sort of responsible oversight. And so ecotourism seeks to take back that same market and use it responsibly. So over a third of U.S. travelers have taken at least one eco tour by the mid-1990s. And in the early 2000s, ecotourism grew by 30% compared to 4% growth rate of the actual average U.S. travel industry. So it's becoming more and more popular in more recent times. And this slide just kind of shows you all of the different general types of tourism. So you can kind of call this the adrenaline junkie, the extreme tourism. These are people who like to go places and jump out of planes, etc. You have mass tourism, going to see the Eiffel Tower. And then you have ecotourism, going to that remote village in Uganda to discuss their, I actually don't know, I'm going to make this off the top of my head, but let's say that they have a very specialty type of blanket that they weave or something like that. So going to a third world village with the intention of funding a little bit of their local economy by buying their arts and watching their culture and learning about their language and history, etc., in a responsible manner that helps preserve the environment. So again, ecotourism is responsible travel, and you're usually going someplace that's pristine and fragile, right? Someplace that is beautiful now but is on the verge of being taken away. Someplace that has, for example, a lot of mahogany wood and is set to be, and it's very tempting to chop that wood down instead of leaving those forests. Protected areas that strive to be very low impact and often very small in scale. So we're not talking about traveling with a lot of people, we're talking about traveling with a small amount of people, and we're probably not talking about going to a large hotel chain. We're probably talking about going to a small bungalow or a bed and breakfast or something like that. So smaller scale places that don't host a lot of people, where the money goes more directly into the local economy instead of straight up the ladder to the big boss's pockets. So what does sustainable mean? Right? And basically what sustainable means is that you intentionally try to minimize the amount of damage to the environment and intentionally try to minimize the use of natural resources. So using renewable resources whenever possible, locally produced food, etc. Anything that you can get from the local economy and not have to transport in puts money back into the local economy, which is kind of the point. And this is just a little bit about mass tourism and how it's actually anti-eco-friendly, if that makes sense. It's incredibly not eco-friendly. First of all, tourists, when they go on vacation, they tend to feel like they're super rich and they tend to be very wasteful, consuming huge amounts of food and water from the local environment, and depleting resources from the environment, consuming large amounts of energy, right, leaving all the lights on. Hotels are notorious for energy consumption, and oftentimes that energy consumption originally comes from fossil fuels, particularly if you've got a plant nearby that's like creating that electricity from fossil fuel use. And additionally, it's not just the local fossil fuel use, it's the carbon footprint from the travel as well. Tourists are traveling generally by plane in large numbers, and that's going to increase the atmospheric pollution from the planes. Again, this is all pre-COVID. Right now, the airline industry is struggling, but previous to this, we were seeing a lot of air travel, and tourist resorts tend to be a lot less likely to pay attention to what's happening to the natural environment. Their building and drainage schemes are typically set up to serve them and not to serve the ecosystem as a whole. So let's talk about ecotourism and how that's different from mass tourism. And again, we're going to come back to two concepts. In fact, I would throw a third concept in here of education. So stewardship, conservation, and education. So stewardship means that you take the land that you have and you take care of it, right? Anything that you intend to do development-wise, you plan it in a sustainable manner, and you manage the environment as though it is its own resource instead of something to just be gobbled up and consumed. And then conservation obviously is local, so you're trying to talk about preserving the local environment. And it also is going to allow a local economy by bringing local people in. And then, of course, education is going to be educating the tourist, but not only the tourist, but then the community the tourist returns home to. And hopefully they'll share their stories. So conservation, stewardship, and education. All right, but don't be fooled. There's a whole secondary industry out there, just like there's a knockoff market for handbags, etc. There's a ecotourism light, basically, and it's called greenwashing. And basically what they do is they slap a label on something by making a minimal change, reduced water usage because they run one less load of laundry a year, and so they slap a label on it that actually doesn't do anything but makes the individual feel good for purchasing it. So minor cost-saving modifications that don't actually transform tourism as a whole into a tool and it doesn't do anything that protects the environment or benefits the local community. It just makes the tourist feel a little bit better. So again, the main things that you're looking for are protection of the environment, some sort of economic benefit to the local community, right, and education to the individual who's traveling. And why is this important? It's not just important for the tourists themselves, but it's also important for their communities that they return home to and the future generations that they're going to discuss this with. So here's an ecotourism case study in the Galapagos Islands in Ecuador. And the Galapagos Islands are a gorgeous place. You may recognize it as something where Charles Darwin went and looked at a lot of different finches and their bead length and then ended up writing on the origin of species. Um, and another example of them. And they're very famous because they have a lot of diversity. Plants and animals that are not found anywhere else in the world. So they're very unique. And that's because they're very isolated, and the further isolated away, the more chances for diversification can happen, speciation, and so that allows for the creation of plants and animals, or the evolution of plants and animals that are completely separate from the rest of the world. And that's been happening for hundreds of thousands of years. And again, if you recognize them at all, you probably recognize them because of Charles Darwin. And 90% of them are designated as national parks, although there are approximately 20,000 human residents. And that allows for a great degree of protection from the environment. So what is the issue? The issue is that ecotourism, or tourism tourism in general, has actually been damaging the local economy. So even though, well, not the economy, but the local environment. So even though the economy is good, the conservationists and scientists that are coming to visit and all of the tourists, et cetera, that are coming in are actually not benefiting the islands as a whole. So what are the solutions, right? So let's think about some solutions. And before I do that, I want to present this is Lonesome George, and he is no longer with us, but he was the very last pinta tortoise in the whole world. And that meant that he had no mate. He was fated for extinction, but until he was dead, the species was still considered endangered. However, everyone knew it was coming, and now that he is gone, this species is now extinct. So how can we use ecotourism to help wildlife, such as George, from becoming extinct? So the idea is that we are still bringing people to these locations, but we're doing it without damaging the local environment. So what are the major characteristics of tourism, of ecotourism? So we have 6 major characteristics. 1, you're going to be going to an undisturbed natural area. No one's going to go on an ecotourism tour of New York City and downtown Manhattan, right? I'm not from the East Coast, so if you are, that probably doesn't make any sense. But we're here from Honolulu, and no one is going to be going someplace to a large city, is my point. And additionally, there's a learning benefit. You're not just going to lay on the beach, drink margaritas, and enjoy the sunshine. Right? You're going to be educated about the local community, the culture, etc., and it's going to have a different quality of an experience, more of a homey feel than a tourist feel, right? You're a traveler, not a tourist. And the money that you're putting into the trip is going to be benefiting the local community. So instead of just the money going to Hilton or whatever your large travel chain is, you're going to end up giving that money to the person who designs and creates hand-woven hammocks or blankets or the art or the food, the design of the local community. So their money is going to be going to local area craftsmen, and instead of a hotel chain, perhaps a local bed and breakfast, etc. So that means that that money would be directly going to people who are locally employed as well. Additionally, instead of just going to places for the sake of going to places, there's like a hide and seek kind of piece to this environment. So ecotourists are going to seek to find rare species or spectacular landscapes, something that's a little bit more unusual, a little bit more exotic, and they often are the kind of person, when they bring that home, they're going to want to show that off. Additionally, they're taking photographs, leaving only footprints, right? So they're not depleting local resources, attempting to sustain the environment and undo damage if they can. So they might take time while they're there to help rebuild a rock wall, or to help replant a local community's gardens, or something like that, something that can help undo the damage that has been done to the local environment. Ecotourists are going to appreciate the local customs, local culture, traditions, etc. They're going to try to eat like the local people. They're going to try to sleep in the hammocks the way the local people sleep, etc. And I know that seems a little exaggerative, but my point is that they're not going to expect to have the same comforts of the first world environment that they're accustomed to. So the major attributes of ecotourism is that we are conserving the ecosystem and the species within the ecosystem, as well as the people within that ecosystem, right? So livelihood for the local communities by bringing the tourist dollar, right? Remember that first world dollar stretches a very far away in a third world country. Additionally, ecotourism is a conservation effort that's community-based. So it wouldn't just be one individual coming. It would be a stream of individuals over time, constantly coming through. And that would mean that we'd have cooperation by the members of the community as well that would be offering that ecotourism benefit to the travelers. So these individuals hopefully would be benefiting more financially from tourism than from the slash and burn agriculture or from ranching, etc., which were previous practices that, again, were decimating the local environment. So if you can give them an alternative to feed their families that allows them to protect their forests, they're very likely to take it, especially if it involves allowing them to pursue their local traditions, cuisines, and cultural art, etc. So it's very important that the members of the community are actively involved, that we're not just bringing in people from other places, that we have people who are local people who are benefiting directly from the tourist efforts. All right, so the objective, of course, would be to help preserve ecosystems and natural areas that have high tourism potential. So something's very unique or special about this area that makes people who are thrill seekers want to come, or people who have the idea of wanting to have a hide and seek and see, or scavenger hunt and see particular regions of the world. Additionally, the idea is to cultivate an environmental consciousness among the local population. So teaching them that the slash and burn techniques are going to actually end up being not going to be beneficial in the long run, even though they might be beneficial now. So the dangers of overexploiting their resources and having unrestricted tourism access, and additionally providing an alternative to that slash and burn agriculture, etc. So new economic incentives, selling their products, their locally made crafts, their artisans, setting up shows that people can spend money and come watch their dances and listen to their songs and their plays, right? Also medicinal plants, etc. So some sort of entrepreneurial skills that gives them a little bit more than just being the butler, just being the person who runs the bed and breakfast, something that is actually a skill that is coveted and unique and something that is worthwhile to pursue. Again, this comes back to community. So we want to make sure the community, if they don't actually own, they own a good percentage of, and can control the bed and breakfast, etc., so that the profits are going to flow into the community instead of all the way up the hands into the personal pockets of the CEO of whatever corporation. This allows the individuals that are in that local community to foster a feeling of pride and community, because they're able to preserve their traditional practices and cultural techniques. Again, they're a little bit more, they're definitely more than just a bellhop or just someone who's going to come and clean your rooms after you've left. They're actually going to be the tour guides, and they're going to be showing you how they make specialty nuts, maybe running classes on how to create leis, etc. So they can have traditional practices and cultural techniques that now, instead of being lost from generation to the next, can be preserved and enhanced because they have monetary value again. So what does a general ecotourist look like? Usually these are people that are post-college era, 31 to 50. They're generally physically active, and they tend to be better educated. Usually they come from higher income families, and they have a genuine interest in learning about nature and giving back to their environment. They're people who recognize quality and are willing to pay for it. They're not going to haggle for that locally made hammock that they know took the woman in the hot hours to make. They're going to pay what she expects to be paid in their price for her time. Oftentimes they belong to environmental organizations, or at least profess an interest in conservation of their environment. They're socially minded, interested in culture, history, and people in developing countries. All of this underlies that education and teaching aspect that I was talking about earlier. They want to learn about the community, and they want to bring that information that they do learn back to their local towns and pass that information on. So there's several different types of nature ecotourism types. Obviously other typologies are possible, but the first would be what we could be classified as hardcore. Those that are scientific researchers, people who are designed for high education purposes, environmental restoration, etc. They're gung-ho. They come there for a specific reason, Habitat for Humanity, etc. And they are coming with a purpose. Then secondarily, we have people who are dedicated, more moderate, right? People who take trips specifically to see the protected areas. They want to understand local natural and cultural history, but they might not necessarily want to give a lecture on it or assist in rebuilding a habitat or a stream cleanup. And then mainstream people who would like to go to exciting destinations just to take an unusual trip, just to be able to say, I went somewhere that you might not have gone. And then casual, people who might be incidentally or just happen to be walking through and say, let's do this because we're here. Now, nature tourism and wildlife tourism and adventure tourism are all very similar, but there are subtle differences. So nature tourism is when individuals travel to unspoiled places for the purpose of experiencing and enjoying nature. Something like hiking, biking, sailing, camping, but they're generally safer versions. Maybe something like kayaking, right? But they're not going to be doing something like rock climbing. Then we have wildlife tourism, where people are going to these areas, these natural areas, in order to observe the animals in their native habitat. So not just there to see the beautiful scenery, but to intentionally try to catch XYZ in their natural environments. And then adventure tourism is kind of like for the adrenaline junkies. Nature tourism with a bit of a kick, something that's got a little bit of extra physical skill, extra physical endurance, and like rope climbing or deep sea diving, bicycling, paragliding, etc. Some sort of risk taking, often in terrain that's less chartered than some of the other areas that you might travel. And some of the major advantages of ecotourism, obviously, is that ecotourism is a excellent idea for exchange of information from foreign areas. So from areas of the world most people might not travel to, you can learn about those communities and bring that information back and spread the knowledge. And that can be used for the governments of developing countries, because we can end up with money that comes in monetarily that can be used for financing the economic growth and development of that country. Additionally, it provides an alternative than agriculture pursuits. So it's a better form of land use than, for example, farming or slash and burn, etc., especially in arid and semi-arid areas where you might only get a couple rounds of crop from that area before it turns into a desert and you've lost that forest. Additionally, it's economic development. So if it's managed correctly, the money can be funneled directly into the local economies. And that can actually mean that the money from the top going all the way to the bottom, right, from I don't want to call us the wealthiest, but even the poorest American is doing much better than some people in the third world countries. And so you can put the money immediately into the poorest strata of the rural communities. And that means that people who are in disadvantaged rural communities can end up with getting a leg up, right, an extra boost to be able to bring them into the second world nation style living. Additionally, it's an industry without chimneys. What does that mean? It means that we're not going to be pushing another industrial revolution. Now, we as Americans and most of our first world nations actually went through industrial revolutions in order to get from third, second to first world nations. However, that's not something that some of the third world nations today are able to be afforded, right? We simply can't further damage the environment in order to get to the point that they're economically sound. So it's a way that we can promote economic growth without further damage to the environment and assisting with social and economic developments. Additionally, it's a peaceful industry. There's no competition. It promotes respect for other cultures, and because it can only occur in peaceful areas, it deters crime, because if we know that a lot of money is coming into this region, and if we come and rob the tourist in that area, or if we cause some sort of criminal activity in that area and scare people away, we will lose that revenue. So it induces an area or an idea of safety in certain regions in order to mediate that tourist revenue. And it also can promote business partnerships across the world between the private sector, conservation authorities, and residents located nearby or adjacent to these areas that need conservation. And that means that we can end up connecting people from all across the globe to be able to help areas that really are beautiful and pristine, but are super destitute and are on the verge of economic collapse, and therefore considering things like slash and burn agriculture. All right, so why do we think that ecotourism is likely to thrive over time? Overall, there's an increased awareness of environmental problems among the entire world, particularly among tourist populations, and a general willingness of tourists to engage in more socially responsible travel. And there's more interest in visiting lesser-known countries like Thailand and Belize, rather than your traditional vacation getaways. All right, so again, we're going to overview the principles of ecotourism. First and foremost, you want to minimize the negative impacts on the nature and the culture. You want to focus on education of the traveler and the tourist, not only on the importance of conservation as is listed here, but also on the culture of the local community. Also underscoring the importance of being a responsible business partner, so you can work cooperatively with local authorities to make sure that the money is actually getting directly into the local economy, and that means that we can further the conservation benefits of the region. Again, directing the revenues to the conservation and management of the natural area so that we can avoid things like slash and burn, etc. Additionally, we can bring economic benefit to the host country. Bringing more money in means that we can then allow things like culture and art to thrive in those areas when they're no longer worried about putting food in their family's mouth. And it also means that we can have responsible tourism so that the development of the tourist areas doesn't exceed the social and environmental limits as determined by whatever the local residents say, because the people in the local communities are given far more control under these infrastructures. All right, so the idea is we're going to minimize the use of our things like fossil fuels, etc., and conserve our local environments, our plants and wildlife, and blend with the natural and cultural environment. So those are the major principles of ecotourism. So if you were to plan an ecotourism community, how are you supposed to do this responsibly? Well, first you need to use conservation measures that are already in place in order to count all of the flora, fauna, and etc. in the ecosystem, as well as any archaeological or historical sites and local culture. So you have to know what you have before you figure out if you can impact it, right? And once you know what you have, then you have to figure out how many extra you can handle. And that's what's called a carrying capacity. So you establish carrying capacity standards so that the tourist facilities don't end up overdeveloped, so that they don't overuse the natural resources and decimate the environment, making sure that we don't overuse or depreciate things like water, etc., of the natural areas. And then you seek to develop those tourist facilities in the most environmentally suitable locations as possible, using locally based architecture, designs, materials, and energy-saving devices whenever possible, including proper disposal of whatever your waste materials are. And doing this in a small scale is much more likely to be environmentally compliant. Large-scale developments are much more difficult to work with in terms of being environmentally friendly. And additionally, have an education center, some sort of visitor center that has resources for tourists that talk about the site, the local conservation attractions, and how you can actually benefit the local community. Additionally, prepare and distribute tourism codes of conduct for both the tourists and the tour operators so that they know what they're expected. They know that they're not supposed to litter in the environment, etc. They're not supposed to take the native plants or do any damage to the native ecosystems and wildlife. And then educate not only the tourists, but the tour guides. Provide well-trained tour guides who not only are going to take people out to go see the destinations, but have information that they can offer, including biological diversity or conservation management, etc. Additionally, that they set a good example. So they're going to have good conservation behavior and oversee the good conservation behavior of their tourists during their tours, so that we have a good overview of what's going on while these tours are happening. And last but not least, this is actually very important, integrate the local community into the ecosystem of the ecotourism development. Have local architects and local builders, have local tour guides, have local artisans and crafts, etc. in these communities, so that we can provide jobs and income and also keep alive the cultures and traditions of the community. All right, so we just talked previously about false ecotourism, and so these are ways that you can determine that you have authentic ecotourism. One, obviously, you're traveling to a natural destination that has some sort of unique property to it, and you're minimizing your impact on the environment. You're going to be learning something, building environmental awareness, providing direct financial benefits somehow. So not just to your plane operator, etc., but the money is actually going directly to the local community and for conservation efforts. Providing financial benefits and empowerment to the local people. And not just that the local people are there to change the bed sheets and do a lot of things that it has always been traditionally imposed upon locals in a community when a tourism and a hotel springs up, but actually something that are higher levels of thinking, right? And also incorporate culture and the other local community efforts into these designs so that we can financially empower the local people and respect, support, and cultivate the local culture. So whatever was their local arts and crafts is able to be maintained and preserved for future generations. Okay, again, tourism activity usually occurs, or these ecotourism activity usually occurs in undisturbed natural settings with limited negative impacts on the environment, with the idea of conservation of the natural and cultural heritage and an active involvement with and benefit to the local community, and all the profits, or most of the profits, contribute to sustainable development and also to the local community, and provide an educational experience for the visitors. It's going to incorporate both the natural wonder of the land and the cultural heritage of the people who live there. All right, so now I'm going to have some scathing remarks about conventional mass tourism. And generally, mass tourism is synonymous with what we call the four S's. And you can imagine that sun, sea, sand, and sex. Right? It's basically Waikiki, right? I'm just joking. But the point is that, and all of these do apply to Waikiki, high infrastructure costs are associated with the development of mass tourist areas. Overdevelopment and uneven development of these areas, right? They take advantage as much as possible. Adverse social effects, including invasion by culturally insensitive and economically disruptive foreigners. That sounds like Waikiki, doesn't it? Also, adverse environmental effects and pollution, right? So these hotels use a lot of water and they use a lot of electricity, so they use a lot of natural resources and provide meager economic benefits to the community because most of the profits actually leave the host country and go straight up the food chain to the pockets of the CEO. So the only economic benefits happen because of the leakage, right? The payment to the maids and the bus boys and bellhops that then they can use to pay for their rent and their local food sources, etc. So most of the profits do not stay in the host countries. Oftentimes, the only benefit of mass tourism to the local community is found in the low-paying jobs, like I was just saying, maids, waiters, drivers, etc. So the idea is to give the local community higher, not just higher paying, but higher thinking levels of jobs, right? Give them things that allow them to explore the arts and culture of their environment and preserve things that would otherwise be lost from one generation to the next. Again, most of the money in mass tourism goes to airlines, hotels, etc. It goes straight up the pocket. Same thing with hotel chain restaurants. Money goes straight up the chain. Additionally, the food that comes into the hotel chain restaurants doesn't come from the local population. It comes from imported food products. And additionally, they rarely employ local staff for senior management position. They employ them for the lower level positions, but they source within the company and then send people to the on-site or on-premises. So I apologize, that means that they generally don't provide income to the local farmers, local workers, etc. So the locals do not reap benefits from the presence of these huge tourism industries. Additionally, and last but not least, they overconsume natural resources, water and power, etc., which causes an increase in utility prices all the way across the board and sometimes can cause things like blackouts and water shortages for local populations. Hotel gift shops could very well have local cultural trinkets for sale, but instead they generally import or buy mass-produced gift items because they're much cheaper than those produced by local craftspeople and artisans. And most tourists never even leave the hotel grounds, so they generally don't even have the possibility to give the tourist income to local businesses. So that means that locals aren't reaping any of the benefit from tourism, and because they have to look elsewhere for economic income, they lose the incentive to preserve and conserve their natural resources. And this is obviously quite a shame because people come to these places specifically for the purposes of recreation. And additionally, obviously, we need to have these areas of beauty and respite and preserved natural environments in order to be able to preserve our world for everyone, for the generations to come. All right, so if you were to start some sort of ecotourism industry, how would you do it? So these are some strategies to achieve the principles of ecotourism. One, keep your enterprise small. Small scale, grassroots development, and bring in the desires and opinions of local people. Ask questions of the local people and see what we can offer in order to make the best policies that best benefit the local community. When you're doing construction and maintenance, make sure that you are following environmental protocols, and additionally, hire local people and use local materials. Demonstrate upfront commitment to environmental objectives. And exploit small market niches with personalized services, unique experiences, things like hammocks and locally sourced rugs, etc. Make sure that the local culture is able to have some sort of financial benefit in order to be able to pass down these local heritage items from one generation to the next. Educate the host community. This is vital. Have educational programs in place so that tourists who plan to visit are able to learn about their local communities and their local environments, so that not only we can provide them with a good experience, but they'll take that information back to wherever it is that they came from. Always prioritize conservation over short-term profits. You're looking much longer term than the short-term normal tourism industry. Work with the locals, gain local enthusiasm as much as possible, and make sure that the benefits are shared as fully as possible so that no one shoulders a disproportionate share of the cost or the work, and try to develop an economy that relies on other things other than tourism as the sole source of income for the community. So don't rely solely on tourism for your income. If you follow these principles, then you can figure out a way to gain government support. Then you're able to figure out ways to provide financial backing to the indigenous people who are originally would lack the resources to be able to start their own business initiatives, etc. And then offer the money back to the community in terms of small grants so that they can acquire education or start their local businesses. Help provide some sort of organization and coordination of your ecotourism efforts so that the small communities have access to knowledge about sustainable development and to prevent abusive systems like this without allowing the government control to overshadow your local interests. The objective is for the local interest to be the top priority, for the conservation efforts to be the top priority. And strive for a minimum of 80% local staffing, and not just at those lower level positions, but at the higher level positions as well. And strive, if you can, for local ownership. So even if you have to provide the funding up front, eventually provide a way that the locals are able to, over time, start to buy back their own ecotourism industry. All right, so I know that's a little bit above and beyond what we as the individuals are able to do, right? None of us are running out right now to go buy a small ecotourism business. But here are some things that you as a responsible ecotourist can do. Always take advantage of locally owned and locally operated businesses, lodges, hotels, tour guides, etc., taxis, buses, car rental agencies. Always try to take advantage of something that's a small business if possible. Support tour companies and accommodations that employ local people and purchase locally grown food stuff. So try to eat local and try to buy local. Eat in local restaurants, shop in local markets, purchase souvenirs from local shops and artisans, not from things that are on the store that clearly came from China, even though they have the name of the location on there. And always make an effort to offer a fair price. I know part of going to a third world is being able to barter and figure out how low you can go. But make sure that you're trying to, if possible, put the money back into the pockets of the local community. After all, that's why you're there, to try to funnel money into the local environment so that they don't have to decimate their local environment. Always pay access fees to protected sites, even if they're voluntary. Make sure that you give the money back, right? Put your money where your heart is, because your money supports local efforts to conserve the areas that you think are so beautiful. Anytime possible, frequent cultural events, because your money is very important for local artists and performers to help encourage preservation of the cultural heritage. Same thing for local artisans and local shops. Because the objective of ecotourism is to offer an opportunity for communities and individuals to be able to have the conservation of interesting natural and cultural resources so that they can develop sustainable economic strategies. This way they can avoid pursuing environmentally damaging patterns of resource use. The idea is to find a compromise between preservation and development, and this can be challenging often because the objective for most people is the bottom dollar. And so ecotourism is a way that we can bridge this gap, where we can generate the additional environmental revenue without generating additional environmental problems, right? Ecotourism is able to do this if it follows the principles that we outlined previously, using wise development strategies, monitoring and protection of local resources, and fair distribution of profits within the host community. This way it can avoid the pitfalls of unsustainable or unregulated tourism that damages the resources we all value. So to summarize before I end this lecture, I would like you in the future to consider putting your travel budget where your heart is and encourage your friends and family to do the same. Thank you so very much for listening to me today. I appreciate your time and effort, and I will see you on my next lecture. Aloha and happy studying.